In the winter of 1901, something extraordinary was taking shape on the eastern shore of Long Island. A structure unlike anything America had seen before rose from the barren landscape. To most observers passing by, it looked like the fever dream of a mad inventor. But this was no fantasy. This was the beginning of an experiment that would challenge every assumption about how our world generates and distributes energy. Welcome to Infinite Findings, the place where we investigate the world's most perplexing mysteries and the stories that history tried to bury. The man orchestrating this impossible vision was Nikola Tesla. His name has become synonymous with genius, but also with obsession, with unchecked ambition, and with aspirations that terrified the most powerful people on Earth. What began as a simple project would soon transform into something far darker. What ended that spring night in 1903 would spawn decades of questions and official silence. And the only person who truly witnessed what happened never spoke about it until the very end of her life. Today, we're telling that story. The fortress of science on Long Island. By the turn of the 20th century, Tesla had already changed the world. His alternating current technology had fundamentally reshaped how electricity moved through civilization. While Thomas Edison clung to his direct current systems, unable to see the future Tesla had already visualized, the inventor was working towards something that would dwarf even these revolutionary achievements. In Shoreham, New York, J.P. Morgan, the titan of American finance, had agreed to support Tesla's vision with capital that equaled millions in today's dollars. Morgan believed he was funding a wireless communications tower, a way to transmit messages across oceans without cables or relays. This was already an ambitious goal. Marconi in Europe had proven it was possible. For America to lead in this technology was something Morgan understood instinctively. It was power. It was dominance. It was the future. But Morgan did not know the full scope of Tesla's ambitions. Beneath the surface of what everyone believed was being constructed lay an entirely different purpose. Tesla's vision was far more radical. He wasn't simply interested in sending voices and messages through the ether. He wanted to transmit the energy itself. Electricity. Power. Free. Limitless electricity available to every receiver on the planet tuned to the correct frequency. Not metered. Not measured. Not sold. Available to everyone. This was a dream that would have terrified any industrialist who depended on selling power by the kilowatt. But Tesla had kept this secret confined to only his most trusted inner circle. His assistants understood. They had to. The tower that rose from that Long Island landscape became known as Wardenclyffe. It was a lattice structure constructed from wood and steel, nearly 200 feet into the air, crowned with a copper dome that gleamed in the sunlight. It looked less like a scientific instrument and more like a monument to human ambition itself. Yet every extraordinary element of Wardenclyffe existed for a specific purpose in Tesla's grand design. Beneath the structure, workers had excavated an elaborate network of tunnels and underground chambers at his direction. These were not support systems. They were functional components of the transmission apparatus. He had iron pipes driven deep into the water table, creating what he described as an electrical grip on the planetary body itself. Tesla believed the Earth was a conductor, a giant, dormant electrical system waiting to be awakened. This wasn't abstract theorizing. Between 1899 and 1900, Tesla had operated a laboratory in Colorado Springs, where he had generated lightning bolts exceeding 100 feet in length. He had observed the very ground responding to his electrical oscillators. He had detected natural resonant frequencies within the planet itself. Colorado Springs had convinced him that what he was now building in New York was not merely possible. It was inevitable. The first hints of what was really happening emerged through the accounts of Tesla's assistants. One of them, a female engineer whose name would later be deliberately scrubbed from official records, had documented something remarkable during the initial experiments. When Tesla had powered his equipment at lower levels, light bulbs placed miles away from the tower had suddenly illuminated. There were no wires. There was no physical connection between the bulbs and any power source. They simply glowed. In 1901, this was more than impressive. This was impossible according to everything the scientific establishment understood about electricity. But it was also precisely the kind of result that would send waves of panic through the corridors of power. Because now J.P. Morgan was beginning to comprehend what he had actually funded. The electrical grid infrastructure that Morgan and his allies had spent fortunes constructing would become worthless if power could be broadcast freely from a single tower. Every mile of copper wire, every transformer station, every billing mechanism, every mechanism of control over who received power and who did not. All of it would be rendered obsolete by a system that required no infrastructure, no middlemen, no company to manage distribution. Morgan was not a man who took such threats passively. The pressure on Tesla intensified through 1902 and into 1903. Backers were demanding he slow the pace, remain within approved boundaries, be practical, be reasonable, stop pushing towards something that challenged the very foundations of how the energy industry functioned. Tesla refused. He had not built Wardenclyffe to satisfy investors. He had built it for humanity itself. That distinction would prove to be catastrophic. The night everything changed. It was spring of 1903. The surrounding town was asleep. The investors were absent. The reporters were nowhere to be seen. On this particular night, Tesla made a decision that would haunt him for the remainder of his existence. He would push the system to full capacity for the first time. No official accounts were recorded. No government documentation. No detailed scientific logs that could later be reviewed and analyzed. There was only the testimony of one person who was present in that moment. His assistant. Years later, just before her death in 1957, she would sit in front of a recording device and document what she had witnessed. Her voice trembling but resolute, she described every moment of that impossible night. Tesla had begun by personally inspecting the underground network, the iron pipe system that anchored the entire transmission mechanism. This section had always been restricted. Even most of his technical staff were forbidden from entering. He treated this element as the most sensitive component of his entire design, because it was. This was where electricity would surge downward into the planetary body. This was where the Earth itself would become the conduit. When Tesla moved to the central control station, he gave his assistant a single quiet nod. Then he engaged the power. The machinery began with a low vibration that deepened rapidly. The copper coils within the tower's interior structure commenced oscillating. The sound transformed from mechanical humming into something almost organic, something that suggested the structure itself had become alive. The floor beneath their feet began to pulse. Static accumulated in the air around them. Electricity crawled across metal surfaces and instrument housings like living things seeking escape. And then the dome released something extraordinary. A sustained arc of brilliant white-blue electricity shot upward into the night sky. This was not a momentary flash. This was a continuous electrical discharge that remained visible, that did not fade, that hung in the atmosphere like a bridge between earth and heaven. People living for miles in every direction reported that the darkness above Shoreham had been banished. The sky had ignited brighter than anything they had ever witnessed. What occurred next was something that neither Tesla nor his assistant had anticipated. Along the distant shoreline, isolated farmhouses and small structures that possessed no electrical connections whatsoever suddenly erupted in illumination. Lamps blazed to life. Equipment activated. The darkness receded. Invisible forces had accomplished what should have been impossible. But Tesla understood. The experiment was working. Electricity was traveling through the earth itself, through the very soil and stone beneath their feet, traveling through the air above, propagating outward from Wardenclyffe in waves of pure energy, available to be captured and utilized by any receiver properly tuned to accept it. The assistant described Tesla's expression in that moment. Not triumph, not celebration. Instead, something approaching fear. Something like the recognition that he had succeeded in something so profound, so fundamentally transformative, that the implications were only now becoming apparent to him. The demonstration lasted nearly an hour before Tesla finally reduced the power. But the moment it ended, he understood something with absolute certainty. What he had accomplished could not continue. Whether through his own decision or through external pressure, Wardenclyffe would not remain operational. The project would be halted. The conspiracy that followed. Within days of that spring night in 1903, funding was abruptly terminated. J.P. Morgan issued formal instructions that the project was to cease immediately. The financier had invested enormous resources into Wardenclyffe based on one premise. Tesla had built something entirely different. The communication system had become a power transmission mechanism. The practical investment had transformed into a revolutionary technology that threatened every energy company in existence. Morgan pulled his support. The tower went silent. What followed next was far more sinister than mere project cancellation. Tesla was eventually forced to abandon Wardenclyffe. The facility fell into disrepair. The machinery was dismantled. The tower itself would eventually be demolished. But before all of that occurred, something crucial happened. The documentation disappeared. Years after Wardenclyffe had fallen silent, researchers attempting to reconstruct Tesla's work sought out the people who had labored there. The technicians who had operated the equipment, the assistants who had witnessed the experiments, the engineers who had understood the design. They encountered something remarkable: deliberate refusal to cooperate, not polite declining, not simple unavailability. The refusal felt orchestrated, as though each person had received explicit instructions to remain silent. No exceptions, no conversations, no revelations. One journalist came perilously close to exposing the truth. He had spent months investigating. He had located surviving documentation. He had secured interviews with witnesses willing to speak. His article was nearly complete. Publication was scheduled. Then, suddenly, the story was withdrawn. When pressed about his decision, he offered only vague allusions to pressure, threats, forces he refused to name. The story was never published. When Tesla himself died in 1943, government officials arrived quickly at his hotel room. The FBI catalogued every item, every notebook, every technical file. They produced a formal inventory of everything removed from his residence. Yet when subsequent analysts reviewed this catalogue, they discovered something profoundly unsettling. The documents describing Tesla's wireless power transmission methodology were absent, not listed as destroyed, not catalogued as lost or misplaced, described simply as relocated, a word that had never been defined, a destination that was never specified. No documentation was ever released that indicated where these materials had been transferred. Decades later, in the 1980s, newly declassified FBI documents released through the Freedom of Information Act contained tantalizing references. Buried within hundreds of pages were occasional mentions of Wardenclyffe-related materials. The same word appeared repeatedly: relocated. A separate memo confirmed that a physicist from the National Defense Research Committee, the military research organization that coordinated weapons development during World War II, had reviewed Tesla's research shortly after his death. The memo noted the potential application of this work to national security interests. But the original documents themselves never surfaced publicly. Not then. Not in the decades that followed. The electrical ghost that refused to fade. Researchers throughout the late 20th century attempted to reconstruct what had actually occurred during that 1903 experiment. They scoured archives. They interviewed aging former employees of Wardenclyffe. They tracked down the surviving correspondence of people involved in the project. But the most compelling evidence came not from documents or testimony. It came from data. In the early 2000s, an electrical engineer historian located archived telegraph station records from Long Island and the eastern seaboard. Entries dated to the identical night as Tesla's experiment contained descriptions of electromagnetic disturbances of unexplained origin. Multiple telegraph operators reported continuous interference disrupting their signals. Not the familiar static of atmospheric storms. Not normal electrical noise. Something that behaved as though the ground itself had become charged with electricity. Magnetic instruments across multiple locations registered unusual fluctuations during the same time frame. At several geophysical observatories on both sides of the Atlantic, sensors logged an unexplained electromagnetic pulse. When researchers examined the frequency of this pulse, they discovered it matched precisely the resonant frequency that Tesla had documented in his Colorado Springs laboratory notes. the frequency that he believed corresponded to the Earth's natural electrical standing wave. What happened next was striking. When modern physicists plotted these historical readings on a map, the disturbances formed a distinct wave pattern. That pattern was centered on a single geographic location, Shoreham, New York, the precise location of Wardenclyffe Tower. The anomalous signal persisted for more than 40 minutes before gradually dissipating. No thunderstorms were recorded that night. No solar flares struck the Earth. No geomagnetic events were documented by any scientific body. The event remains catalogued in scientific literature as an anomalous terrestrial resonance event, unexplained, unexplainable, occurring only once in recorded history. But there was something else. Years after these telegraph records were analyzed, a declassified document from the 1940s surfaced. It came from the archives of the National Defense Research Committee. The memo referenced a persistent geophysical signal that exhibited characteristics consistent with Tesla's predicted resonant frequency. The language was carefully chosen, bureaucratic and deliberately vague, but the implication was unmistakable. The 1903 discharge from Wardenclyffe may have fundamentally altered the electrical properties of the Earth's upper crust, and that alteration had not reversed itself in the 4 decades since the experiment occurred. Several scientists who subsequently examined this declassified memo suggested something extraordinary. Perhaps Tesla had not simply transmitted electricity through the air. Perhaps he had temporarily energized a natural electrical pathway already present within the planetary structure itself. A pathway that, once activated, did not simply deactivate when power was cut. Instead, it had weakened gradually over time, continuing to vibrate at its resonant frequency, never completely ceasing. If this interpretation is accurate, then Tesla's greatest achievement was neither recognized nor documented in any official capacity. He had fundamentally altered the electrical nature of our planet, and then he had been forced to walk away from his creation. Modern measurements continue to reveal anomalies at the former Wardenclyffe site. Researchers detect faint, irregular electrical fluctuations at frequencies consistent with Tesla's surviving technical notes. The signals remain just above the threshold of reliable detection. Some scientists attribute these to interference from modern electrical infrastructure. Others argue persuasively that these represent genuine remnants of something that began in spring of 1903 and continues resonating into our present moment. The question persists. Is this the echo of what Tesla built? Or is it evidence of something he discovered that transformed our understanding of planetary physics in ways that history has conspired to conceal? What cannot remain a question is the pattern of events that followed his demonstration. The abrupt termination of funding. The removal of technical materials that have never been satisfactorily accounted for. The orchestrated silence maintained by everyone who possessed first-hand knowledge of the project. The documents classified and relocated to undisclosed archives. Tesla reportedly spoke to his assistant after that night in 1903. He said they had confirmed it worked, and that confirmation was precisely why it could not be allowed to continue. When his assistant asked who they were, Tesla never answered directly, but his expression suggested he knew precisely who held the power to stop him. Somewhere beneath the soil of that Long Island location, at the exact frequency Tesla devoted his existence to understanding, something continues to pulse with the same electrical rhythm that began more than a century ago. Whether this represents an echo of his brilliant creation or evidence of a discovery so profound that governments determined it must remain concealed is a question that official records have systematically avoided answering. The mystery endures, the signal persists, and the truth about what happened in that tower remains one of science's greatest untold stories. If this investigation into one of history's most perplexing mysteries fascinated you, make sure to like this video and subscribe to Infinite Findings for more deep dives into extraordinary discoveries and the stories that have been deliberately hidden from public view. Leave a comment telling us which unsolved scientific mystery you think we should investigate next. We're committed to uncovering the truth that others prefer to keep hidden. Thanks for joining us on this journey, and we'll see you in the next Infinite Findings investigation.